My name is Kimberly, and I married Quentin when I was young and full of dreams. We've been in love since high school, and I thought we'd be happy forever. My father, a successful businessman who owns a furniture factory, gave us a beautiful house as a wedding gift. 3 years after the wedding, our son Michael was born. Over the years, I've devoted myself entirely to becoming the perfect housewife and mother. I kept our house immaculately maintained, cooked delicious meals, and made sure Michael had everything he needed. Quentin's career as a sales manager was not progressing as fast as he had hoped. One evening, he came home upset and angry. "Damn it, Kimberly, I can't take this anymore. I'm ripping my ass off at work, and for a pittance." He slammed his fist on the kitchen table, startling me. "What do you want me to do about it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, even though anxiety was already building in my chest. Quentin's eyes lit up. "Your father could give me a job at his factory, in a senior position. You could talk to him, couldn't you?" I hesitated. My father was always honest in business dealings, and I didn't want Quentin to get a job just because of family ties, but when I saw the desperation in his eyes, I nodded. "Okay, I'll talk to him." The next day, I visited my father in his office. "Dad, I need to ask you something," I began nervously. "It's about Quentin. He's not happy with his job, and I was wondering if you could find a place for him at the factory." The father was silent for a long time, thinking, and then nodded. "I'll give him a chance, but he'll have to prove himself like anyone else." When I told Quentin the news, he was thrilled. He picked me up in his arms, spun me around the kitchen, laughing, and then, lowering me, hugged me to him. "You're amazing, Kimberly. It will change everything for us." And that's what happened for a while. Quentin started making more money, our financial problems receded, and it seemed to me that everything was going for the better. But one problem was replaced by another, and this problem was named Helen. Quentin's mother was a woman with a tough personality, confident in her own right and categorical in everything. She fiercely defended her only son and never hid that she thought I wasn't good enough for him. She came unannounced, interfered in everything I did, criticized my housekeeping skills, and made it clear that she considered herself the boss in my house. "Kimberly, who cleans up like that? Look at all the dust on the shelves," she said, running her finger over the furniture that I had just wiped. "Did you cook that chicken again? Quentin doesn't like chicken, why don't you listen to him? Michael is so pale, aren't you watching his diet?" I tried not to react, but each of her visits left me feeling annoyed and powerless. One afternoon, when I was busy cooking dinner, Helen burst into the house without even calling. "Kimberly, I need you to take me to the mall right now." I gritted my teeth. "Helen, I'm busy cooking, can it wait until tomorrow?" Her eyes narrowed. "Are you saying that my needs aren't important after all I've done for this family?" I stifled a sigh, realizing that resisting would only make the situation worse. "Of course not. Just give me a few minutes to finish up here." When I took Helen to the mall, she criticized my driving style all the way, talked about Quentin, what kind of groceries I buy, and even found a reason to complain about my hairstyle. I clenched my fingers on the steering wheel, trying not to show my irritation, but it was already boiling inside me. I couldn't help but wonder how my life had turned into this endless indulgence of other people's desires and whims, a constant race for the approval of those who didn't seem to appreciate my efforts at all, and how it happened that I, once an intelligent, capable, and hopeful woman, had turned into a shadow of myself. I was busy solely satisfying the needs of others, while my own dreams were gathering dust in the far corner of my mind, forgotten, faded. One particularly difficult day, when I was already feeling depressed after hours of cleaning, washing, and trying to keep the house in perfect condition, Helen, as usual, burst into our house without the slightest warning, slamming the door loudly and looking around irritably, as if checking to make sure everything was in order. "Kimberly," her voice, harsh and demanding, echoed through the kitchen, making me cringe inwardly. I'm hungry, make me something to eat. Biting my tongue so as not to say anything unnecessary, I silently put down the stack of freshly ironed laundry that I had just sorted and headed to the kitchen, cursing this endless role of a submissive servant in my own home. While I was cooking, Helen sat down at the table, crossing her arms over her chest and not missing an opportunity to comment on my every move. Displeasure flashed in her eyes, and there was undisguised mockery in her voice. "You're using too much oil," she snapped, curling her lip as I fried the vegetables. "For God's sake, cut them up. Don't you know how to cook?" I clenched my teeth, trying not to show annoyance, because any protest I made would only prolong this unpleasant conversation. When I finally put a plate of hot food in front of her, hoping that now she would at least eat quickly and leave, to my disappointment, Helen suddenly stood up, grabbed the dish and, with a casual wave of her hand, declared, "I'll take this with me. I'm having a bridge club tonight, it's perfect for a snack." I stared at her in complete disbelief, not believing my ears. "Helen, but this was supposed to be our dinner." She shrugged, already heading for the door. "Oh, you can always make more. You have nothing better to do." With that, she left, leaving behind only the smell of her heavy perfume and a feeling of emptiness. I slowly sank into a chair, feeling tired and powerless with renewed vigor, and then, looking at the clock, I realized with horror that I had less than an hour left to cook another dinner before Quentin arrived. When Quentin returned from work, I was in a feverish hurry trying to finish the second portion of the meal, trying my best so that he wouldn't feel the difference and wouldn't notice that I had already cooked this dinner twice that evening. He took off his jacket, loosened his tie, and frowned as he looked around the kitchen, which was bustling with nervous activity. "What's going on? Why isn't dinner ready?" I froze, not knowing where to start, and then, wiping my hands on a towel, I explained everything to him, hoping that he would support me, understand how ridiculous this behavior of his mother was. But instead of sympathy, irritation appeared on his face. "Mom was here, and you didn't make her feel welcome?" He shook his head, as if disappointed in me. "Kimberly, you know how important family is to me, you should have been more helpful." I stared at him in disbelief, trying to process what he had just said. "Helpful? Quentin, she took our dinner, she treats me like a servant in my own house." But he just sighed irritably, as if I were saying something stupid. "You're exaggerating. Mom just wants to feel loved and appreciated. Is that too much?" I swallowed the lump in my throat, realizing that this conversation didn't make sense. We ate a hastily prepared dinner in silence, and I felt the gap between us growing every day. Quentin, once my lover from school, my closest person, now seemed alien, distant, incomprehensible. One evening, Quentin returned home in a terrible mood. His face was red with anger, and his lips were compressed into a thin line. He slammed the door loudly, threw his jacket on a chair, and as soon as he crossed the threshold, he shouted loudly, "Kimberly." I went out into the hallway, already knowing that this conversation would not bring anything good. "What happened?" "Your father is a tyrant." There was fury in his voice. "He humiliates people and uses them as pawns in his little game." I froze. My father has always been a model of justice for me, a man of principles and firm convictions. "What do you mean?" Quentin darted around the room, nervously unbuttoning the cuffs of his shirt. "I stood up for an employee today," he blurted out. "Your father treated him unfairly, and I couldn't just stand by and watch." I tensed, guessing that he was about to say something really terrible. "And what happened?" Quentin stopped, looked at me from under his brows, and, gritting his teeth, spat out, "Your precious daddy fired me." In place. My mind was reeling, my thoughts were racing erratically, trying to find at least some explanation in what had happened that would not destroy my familiar world, because it was not at all like my father. He was always a man of firm principles, fair and honest, and then it seemed to me that in this situation it simply could not be some kind of misunderstanding that could be settled just by talking to him and listening to his side. There must be some mistake, I finally exhaled, trying to stay calm despite the tense atmosphere. Let me talk to Dad, I'll figure it out. No. You're not going to talk to your father, you're not going to talk to your mother, you're not going to talk to them at all. As far as we understand, they no longer exist for us. Do you understand? I felt a chill run through my body, and, unable to argue, I barely nodded with trembling lips, too shocked, too scared to continue this conversation. In the following days, Quentin found another job, returning to his usual income level fairly quickly, and it would seem that everything should have fallen into place. But something in our relationship changed irrevocably, like a crack running through glass, imperceptible, but expanding every day, ready to split it at any moment. Into hundreds of pieces. The warmth and love that I once felt for him was replaced by fear, depression, and resentment, and I increasingly found myself thinking that the Quentin I once married had disappeared, leaving behind only this irritated, short-tempered shadow of the man I knew. Years have passed, and our son Michael has grown into an intelligent, independent young man. He often asked about his grandparents. His childish curiosity did not fade, but Quentin abruptly stopped any attempts to talk about my family. His voice sounded firm and adamant. You have one grandmother, he said, leaving no room for further questions. My mother. That's all you need to know. When Michael was preparing to leave for college in another city, I experienced conflicting feelings. On the one hand, I was incredibly proud of him, for his achievements, for the path he had chosen, but on the other, I felt that I was losing the only ally I had in this house, the only person whose presence at least slightly softened the harshness of the atmosphere around me. In the following years, my life finally turned into an endless series of monotonous days filled with household chores, indulging Quentin's every whim, and enduring constant jabs from Helen. Without Michael, who used to unwittingly distract their attention, their attitude towards me became even more oppressive, and if Helen had at least made an appearance of politeness before, now she no longer hid her contempt, openly pointing out my flaws to me. One afternoon, I was mopping the kitchen floor, trying to ignore Helen, who was sitting at the table and meticulously watching my every move, when suddenly the phone rang. I reached for the phone, but Helen suddenly snatched it out of my hands, glanced at the number, and pressed her lips into a thin line. I'll answer it, she barked, as if she were the hostess of the house, not a guest, and while I stared at her in amazement, she put the phone to her ear. You focus on mopping the floor, I can still see the stains. I gritted my teeth, suppressing the urge to object, and continued working, but I couldn't help but hear her part of the conversation, and my heart started pounding faster by the second. Yes, this is Kimberly's residence, Helen's voice dripped with disdain. Her father? I'm sorry, but Kimberly can't talk to you. Please don't call again. I jerked my head up, shocked to the core. Wait! I exclaimed, but she had already hung up the phone and looked at me coldly. It was your father, she said, as if she were saying something insignificant. I told him not to call anymore. You should thank me for protecting this family from these toxic people. I felt everything inside me boil with anger and disappointment, from the realization that she had crossed a line that had been erased from her eyes for so long. You had no right to do that. I stood up, feeling my voice tremble with emotion. This is my father, should decide for myself if I want to talk to him. Helen's eyes narrowed, and a malicious grin appeared on her face. You're an ungrateful little thing. But before she could finish her sentence, Quentin entered the room, and her expression instantly changed. She immediately pretended to be offended, as if I had just done something unacceptable. Oh, Quentin, she sobbed, pressing her palm to her chest. Your wife treats me so disrespectfully, after all I've done for this family. Quentin turned to me, his face darkening, his eyes flashing with annoyance. Is that true, Kimberly? His voice was menacing, hard, cold. Don't you respect my mother? I opened my mouth, trying to explain, but the words wouldn't come out, because with a sinking heart I realized that no matter what I said, Quentin would still believe her. A year has passed since that fateful phone call from my father, a year filled with the same endless days fused into one suffocating routine in which I no longer existed as a separate person, but only followed other people's desires, obeying orders and indulging whims, not even daring to think about my own needs. Quentin and Helen's control was getting stronger, squeezing me in its invisible shackles every day, and I had almost given up hope that I would ever be able to break out of this prison. But then, on a cool autumn morning, everything changed. I was standing at the stove making breakfast when the phone rang. Quentin was in the shower, but Helen, fortunately, did not come to her daily check of my household, and for the first time in a long time I was able to answer the phone without prying ears, holding my breath, as if anticipating something important. "Hello?" I said uncertainly, clutching the phone tighter in my hand. "Kimberly, is that you?" The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, but it seemed so far away, as if it came from a past that I had long been forbidden to recall. "Dad?" My voice trembled treacherously, and I felt my heart tighten in anxious anticipation. "Kimberly," my father continued, and there was something in his voice that made me tense up even more. "It's your mother. She's very sick. Doctors. They say she doesn't have much time left. You need her, both of us." I felt dizzy, my chest went cold, and I instinctively leaned on the edge of the table, trying to stay on my feet, realizing the meaning of these words, but at the same time not wanting to believe in it. "No," I whispered, feeling hot tears coming to my eyes. At that moment, the bathroom door opened, and I heard Quentin's footsteps. He was coming downstairs, and in a second he would be in the kitchen, which meant that my window of freedom was about to close. "I'll try, Dad," I whispered with difficulty. "I promise I'll try." And before Quentin could come in, I quickly hung up the phone, wiping my face, trying to pull myself together, but my heart was beating so loudly that it seemed as if he already knew everything, as if he felt that something out of the ordinary had happened. "Who was that?" His voice was suspicious, and he slowly approached me, studying my face. I took a deep breath, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "That was my father," I said, trying to keep my voice level, but my voice was shaking anyway. "My mother is very ill, Quentin. She's dying. I need to go to her." His face instantly hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line, and he shook his head as if I had suggested something absurd. "We've been through this before, Kimberly," he said coldly. "Your parents don't exist for us anymore." Something inside me broke at that moment. Some long-forgotten part of me suddenly awoke, protested, screamed at the top of my voice, refusing to obey anymore. "I'm leaving, Quentin," I said, speaking out against him for the first time in years. "With or without your permission. She's my mother, and I'm not going to let her die without saying goodbye." He tensed, his jaw clenched so hard that the muscles stood out on his cheekbones, but I was no longer afraid of him. "Great," he finally said. "One day. That's all you'll get. And then you'll come home. To where you belong." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, because I knew that if I opened my mouth, would burst into tears right in front of him. But one day, it's better than nothing. With shaking hands, I dialed Michael's number, told him everything, and to my surprise and relief, he immediately offered to come with me. His voice was firm and determined, and at that moment I realized that at least one person in this world was still on my side. The next morning, Michael and I went to my childhood home. When we arrived, my father was already waiting for us at the door. He looked older than in my memory, his face was lined with deep wrinkles, and I suddenly realized how much pain he must have gone through over the years. Without saying a word, he stepped forward and hugged me tightly, and at that moment I felt like I had finally returned home. He led us to my mother's room, and when I saw her lying in bed, pale and frail, my heart contracted in a painful spasm, but when our eyes met, a faint but warm light flashed in them. "Kimberly," she whispered, holding out a trembling hand to me. "My baby." I rushed to her, squeezing her hand in mine, wanting to convey through this contact all the love that I had been forbidden to feel all these years. "Mom, I'm here," I said, barely holding back tears. "I'm so sorry. Could you ever forgive me?" She smiled faintly, her fingers lightly squeezing mine. "There's nothing to forgive, honey," she whispered. "I'm just glad you're here now." We spent the whole day at her bedside, sharing memories, laughing and crying, making up for lost years, as if time could be turned back at least a little. But as the sun began to set, my mother's breathing became ragged and heavy, and she squeezed my hand a little harder, her gaze finding mine again. "Kimberly," she said softly, "promise me that you will live your life. You'll really live. Don't let anyone put your spirit in a cage again." Tears streamed down my face as I nodded, pressing her hand to my cheek. "I promise, Mom. I promise." She smiled one last time, and then her eyelids slowly closed and her hand went limp in mine. "She's gone." At the same moment, my phone started ringing insistently. The vibration reverberated in my palm, but I knew, even without looking at the screen, who it was. Quentin. I took a deep breath, went out into the hallway, and, with a trembling hand, put the phone to my ear and answered. Quentin's voice, harsh and steeped in anger, cut through the silence so suddenly that I involuntarily flinched, clutching the phone in my palm, as if it could somehow protect me from his anger. "Where the hell are you, Kimberly?" "Stop it," he roared, and I felt my insides tighten with the familiar terror. "You were supposed to be back a few hours ago." I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to collect my thoughts, but my voice still sounded weak, uncertain, soaked with emotions that I couldn't control. "Quentin, I can't leave yet," I muttered, realizing that it would sound like a challenge, and that he wouldn't tolerate my disobedience. "My mother just died. I need to stay for the funeral." "Absolutely not." His rage was almost palpable now, piercing me with icy needles of fear. "I told you, one day. And that's all you'll get. If you're not back by tomorrow, you don't have to worry about coming back at all." His words hung in the air, a threat and a promise at the same time. I knew he wasn't joking. I knew that if I didn't obey now, there would be no turning back. For a moment, I wanted to give in, drop everything and rush back to the life I knew, to this prison where everything was familiar, where I didn't have to make a choice. But then I remembered my mother's last words, her voice full of love and care, begging me to live my life in a different way. To truly live it without letting anyone put my spirit in a cage again. I took a deep breath, clutching the phone in my hand, and to my surprise, my voice sounded calm, firmer than ever before. "Okay," I said, feeling something inside me straighten out after years of suppression. "I'm staying." And before he could answer, I ended the call. My heart was pounding in my chest, my blood was roaring in my ears, but there was something new in this adrenaline rush, not fear, but something like liberation. For the first time in our married life, I disobeyed Quentin. And it was both frightening and incredibly exciting. The next few days passed in a haze of grief, funeral preparations, and quiet conversations filled with memories. I felt like a part of the family again. I felt the pain of loss mixed with something like relief, because now I was no longer alone. On the day of the funeral, as we stood around my mother's grave, escorting her on her last journey, my phone rang again. I looked at the screen, and sure enough, Quentin's number was displayed. I didn't want his voice to ruin this moment, but without thinking, instead of just turning off the sound, I accidentally pressed speakerphone. "Kimberly, this is your last chance." His voice, full of anger, reverberated over the cemetery, causing those present to freeze in surprise. "If you don't come home right now, I swear I'll come and get you back, do you hear me? You ungrateful. After all I've done for you." My fingers were shaking as I quickly ended the conversation, feeling my face flush with shame, anger, and realization. There was a shocked silence around me. Michael stood next to her, his jaw clenched tightly, and his eyes blazed with rage. The rest of the people present looked confused, but what struck me most was my father's gaze, not angry, not reproachful, but worried, as if he had just finally realized something he had guessed for a long time. When the service was over, he took me aside, away from prying ears, and spoke softly but firmly, looking me straight in the eye. "Kimberly," he began, taking my hands. "We need to talk." We retreated to a quiet corner of the cemetery, and he took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage before saying what he had been holding in himself for a long time. "Honey, there's something you need to know about Quentin." His voice was soft but steely. "Something I should have told you years ago." I froze, and the world around me seemed to shrink in anticipation of these words. "You always believed that he left the company because he stood up for an employee." The father shook his head. His look was full of regret. "But it's not like that." I couldn't breathe, listening to him in numb silence. "Quentin didn't leave. I fired him." His father's voice became firmer. It sounded not only regret, but also determination. "He stole money from the company. He deceived customers, manipulated prices, and appropriated the difference." I shook my head, unable to immediately comprehend the meaning of these words, because it destroyed everything I had believed in for many years. "I fired him to protect my business and my employees," the father continued. "I didn't tell you because I saw how much you loved him, and I didn't want to come between you. But now, hearing him talking to you, seeing what your life has become." He sighed, his hands tightening on mine. "I can't keep quiet anymore." I felt the ground give out from under my feet. All these years, I believed that Quentin was a victim, that he suffered for justice, that he was unfairly kicked out of his job, and that my father was the one who ruined his career, but in fact it was Quentin who ruined everything. I endured his outbursts of anger. I tolerated his coldness. I let him tear me away from my family, deprive me of support, and convince me that I had no right to my own life. And it was all based on lies. "There's something else," the father hesitated, then continued decisively. "I recently heard from a friend that Quentin's company is currently under investigation. There are serious discrepancies in the reports." I slowly looked up at him, my fingers curled into fists. "You mean, he's doing it again?" The father nodded, and his face was unreadable. "I think he's up to his old tricks." And suddenly everything fell into place. The full force of his words hit me like an avalanche, sweeping away the remnants of my illusions, forcing me to see clearly what I hadn't allowed myself to realize all these years. Quentin was not a victim. Quentin was a monster that I allowed to live in my life. I felt a strange, almost unnatural mixture of despair and liberation, realizing that the life I knew was crumbling around me, turning into ruins, but at the same time realizing that from these ashes I finally had a chance to build something new, real, independent of someone else's will, not subject to harsh borders that weren't drawn by me. The day after the funeral, when the weight of the loss was still on my heart, my father, Michael, and I decided to return to my house. I knew that I couldn't put this moment off any longer, that I was going to face the reality that I had been avoiding for so long, but I couldn't even imagine what awaited us upon arrival. When we arrived, we were greeted by an unusual noise coming from the house. The lights were on in the windows, and even from the street you could hear the activity inside. The smells of food wafted from the slightly opened windows, and laughter, the clink of glasses, and music could be heard from inside. All this created the impression of celebration, completely out of place in the light of recent events. We went inside and froze on the threshold, seeing that a full-fledged party was going on in the living room. People were crowding around the set tables, drinking, laughing, talking animatedly, as if this was not someone's family home, but a restaurant open to everyone. Helen, sitting in the center of everyone's attention with a glass of wine in her hand, noticed us first. Her gaze, full of dislike, stopped at my father and Michael, and then shifted to me. "Well, look who's finally decided to honor us with their presence." Her voice was laced with sarcasm, Her lips curled into a venomous grin. "You're late, Kimberly. My birthday party started an hour ago." I froze in place, stunned by this statement, unable to believe that while I was saying goodbye to my mother, while my heart was bursting with pain, there was a celebration going on here, as if nothing had happened. In all the turmoil of the last few days, I had completely forgotten that it was Helen's birthday, but when I saw how easily she dismissed the fact of my loss, I realized that even if she had remembered, it would not have changed anything. Before I could say a word, she got up, came close to me, and, thrusting a dirty rag into my hands, barked. "Don't just stand there. Start cleaning these tables, they won't wipe themselves out." I didn't even have time to process her words, as my father's voice rang out next to me, and his tone was such that I hadn't heard it in many years: firm, uncompromising, thunderous. "How dare you talk to my daughter like that?" he thundered, and the whole room was plunged into tense silence. "She's not your maid, she's not your dog to do your bidding. She's a grown woman who deserves respect." Helen grinned and waved her hand, as if dismissing some nonsense. "Respect?" Her lips curled into a dismissive grimace. She renounced all right to respect the moment she married my son. Her family? She laughed mockingly. "Quentin and I know you're nothing to her anymore." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but the argument between my father and Helen was getting hotter and hotter. Their voices were getting louder, the guests were starting to look at each other. Some of them clearly wanted to leave, not wanting to witness this scandal. And then Quentin burst into the room. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was strained, and his eyes found me instantly, narrowed with rage. "Kimberly, why don't you serve the guests? And what are they doing here?" He pointed angrily at my father and Michael, and something inside me snapped, collapsed, leaving a void into which years of suppressed anger, frustration, and pain poured. "No, Quentin," my voice sounded unexpectedly even, calm, but at the same time clear, like never before. "I don't serve anyone. I don't clean up. And I'm not silent anymore." The room was deathly silent, even Helen seemed at a loss for words. "I know the truth, Quentin," I continued, taking a folder of documents out of my bag. "I know why you really left my father. I know who you really are." I stepped forward and threw the papers I had prepared the day before onto the table. "I've had enough. I want a divorce." For a moment, an expression of such anger flashed across Quentin's face that I thought he was about to rush at me, but then, apparently realizing that he was outnumbered, he just gritted his teeth, his face contorted with rage, but he restrained himself. "Get your damn divorce." "Stop it," he growled. "But don't think you're going to get a dime from me." I couldn't help but laugh because his words were ridiculously ridiculous. "This house is mine, Quentin," I said calmly, and his face paled. "My father gave it to us as a wedding present. Remember? So you're the one who has to leave." The room froze. Quentin stood panting, his gaze darting from me to my father, to Michael, to Helen, who was looking at him with barely concealed horror. And then, realizing that he had lost, he turned around and left the house, and Helen, after giving me one last venomous look, trailed after. As soon as the door closed behind them, I sank onto the couch, suddenly feeling how exhausted I was from the struggle, but at the same time, for the first time in many years, it was easy for me to breathe. Michael, who had been watching in silence all this time, finally spoke, his voice full of emotion. "Mom, why didn't you tell me it was that bad?" I looked at him, at my only son, whom I had been trying to protect from this truth for so long, and sighed. "I'm sorry, Michael," I replied, squeezing his hand. "I thought I was protecting you. But now I realize that I was actually just giving you the wrong lessons about love and respect." In the following weeks, my life changed dramatically, and although I was always afraid of change, it has now become an inevitable and even desirable part of my existence. The divorce process, which promised to be long and difficult, took away my strength, but at the same time brought me the realization that I was finally getting out of the dungeon in which I had lived for many years. I rushed to rebuild my life, step by step restoring the lost independence and confidence that had once been natural to me. My father, true to his word, supported me at every stage of this difficult journey, helping with advice, encouraging, and not allowing me to doubt myself again. One afternoon, when we were sitting in his office discussing the future, he suddenly started talking about a topic I hadn't even expected to hear. "Kimberly," he began, his voice soft but serious. "I've been thinking a lot. I'm not getting any younger, and the factory needs new blood." I looked at him questioningly, not immediately understanding what he was getting at, but he continued without giving me time to think. "How do you feel about Quentin to work with me?" I blinked in surprise. "Me?" My father smiled, shaking his head slightly. "Yes, you are. I also started from scratch once. You're smart, Kimberly, you can learn anything it takes. Besides, it's time for you to spread your wings." His words touched me to the core, and the more I thought about this proposal, the more I realized that this was not just a chance, but an opportunity to find myself anew. In the following months, I immersed myself in studying business, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. My father was a patient teacher, dedicating me with great love to all the subtleties of running a furniture factory, teaching me not only calculations and strategy, but also Quentin how to understand people, how to see beyond simple numbers and build not just production, but something more. I soon discovered that I had a passion for design and innovation that I didn't even know I had, and for the first time in many years, I felt like I wasn't just existing, but really living. Meanwhile, the divorce process continued to drag on. Quentin, as before, fought with me at every turn, disputed ownership of the house, filed endless petitions, stalled for time, tried to manipulate the situation. He even tried to turn Michael against me, hoping that my son would believe his words, but Michael was already an adult and saw the truth, which finally became obvious. In the end, justice prevailed. I was awarded a house, as well as substantial financial compensation for the years of emotional abuse I endured while married to this man. Quentin, who by Quentin's time had already been accused of fraud, was mired in debt and lost the opportunity to hold senior positions. His career built on lies collapsed like a house of cards. As for Helen, she faded into the background, and then disappeared from my life altogether. The last I heard about her, she moved in with a distant relative, her social circle narrowed after the truth about Quentin became public, and her once formidable influence evaporated as if it had never existed. So 3 years flew by, filled with work, growth, new discoveries, and realizations. I turned from a depressed woman who lived in fear into a confident leader, managing a factory, developing a business, and making important decisions. So one Sunday morning, my father called me into his office. I entered, expecting the usual discussion of work issues, but when I saw his face, something inside me turned cold. He motioned for me to sit down. His gaze was full of emotions that I couldn't immediately decipher, but somewhere in the back of my mind I already knew what he was going to say. "Kimberly," his voice was quiet but firm. "I'm not healthy." I froze, feeling the world around me tilt, changing its familiar shape. "The doctors," he paused, then continued, holding my hand. "They don't think I have much time left." "Dad, no." I whispered, reaching for him, as if my touch alone could erase this terrible news. He squeezed my fingers gently. "It's okay, honey. I had a good life, and now I can leave knowing that you are strong, that you are free, that everything will be fine with you." Tears were streaming down my face, and I couldn't stop them. I didn't even try. "I'm leaving everything to you, Kimberly," he continued, and his words caught me off guard again. "Business, home, all this. You've more than proved that you can handle it." I shook my head in shock, but he just smiled softly. "I know you'll take good care of everything." In the following weeks, I spent as much time with him as possible, hanging on his every word, memorizing every minute, trying to absorb as much as possible while I still had the opportunity. My father's condition deteriorated rapidly, but his spirit remained strong, and even when his illness took away his strength, he remained the same person I had always known, wise, kind, and unwavering. He left quietly, peacefully, in a dream, leaving behind not only a huge legacy, but also a part of himself and me. The news of his passing and of Quentin, that the factory now belongs to me, quickly spread through our small town, and while I was still trying to get used to my new reality, an unexpected guest came to me. I heard the doorbell ring, and without hesitation, I went to answer it, unaware that something was waiting for me behind that door that would turn my life around again. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I heard the doorbell ring. I wasn't expecting guests, and a slight anxiety crept into my mind, but I quickly pushed it away, straightened a stray strand of hair and headed for the entrance. When I opened the door, the world seemed to freeze for a moment, and my heart sank with surprise. Quentin was standing on the threshold, still the same as I remembered him in recent years, but something had changed in him. His posture was no longer confident, his gaze was no longer burning with arrogance, and even his clothes, neat but slightly rumpled, it said about Quentin that his life had not been the way he imagined it for a long time. In his hands was a bouquet of flowers, simple, autumnal, without excessive pomp, and for some reason it surprised me the most. "Kimberly," he said, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in years, as if even he was afraid of his own words. "I'm so sorry about your father. Can I come in?" I hesitated, realizing that the door that I had closed in front of him a long time ago was now trying to open again, and I had only a few seconds to decide whether to let it happen. I didn't know what he wanted, I didn't know why he came, but I took a deep breath and stepped aside, allowing him to enter. We stood in the foyer, surrounded by silence that grew heavier with every passing moment, like clouds gathering before a storm. Quentin looked around slowly, as if remembering the house that had once been his, but in which he no longer had the slightest right to be. "I've been thinking about us a lot, Kimberly," he finally spoke, and for the first time there was something like remorse in his voice. "About our life together. Oh, Quentin, how it all turned out. I know I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I've changed." I looked at him skeptically, but said nothing, letting him continue. "My mother," he looked away, running his hand over his face, as if wiping away fatigue. "She died last month." I felt something tighten inside, but not because of the news itself, but because of the way he said it with a barely perceptible note of relief. "She always came between us," he continued, now looking at me again. "Now nothing prevents us from being happy together again." I opened my mouth to reply, but at that moment I heard the sound of a car pulling up to the house. A moment later, the front door opened and a tall, personable man entered, whose features I knew better than anyone else. "Kimberly, darling, I'm home," his warm, confident voice rang out, full of lightness and calm, and he was already taking a step towards me, but suddenly he froze, his gaze fixed on Quentin. Quentin whirled around, his back stiffening, and a look of bewilderment mixed with incipient anger flashed across his face. "Who the hell is this? What is it?" he asked, his voice turning icy, as if he had just realized that the world he had once banished me from continued to exist without him. The man calmly stepped forward and extended his hand. "I'm David, Kimberly's husband. And you, I suppose, are Quentin?" Quentin didn't move, his face contorted with anger. He didn't even look at the outstretched hand. "Husband? What the hell, Kimberly?" His voice trailed off, and his gaze darted between David and me. You got married again? You're a traitor." I shuddered involuntarily, but before I could say anything, David, who had remained calm until then, stepped forward, standing between me and Quentin. His gaze darkened, and his voice became low and dangerous. "I suggest you leave," he said, without raising his voice, but there was steel in his intonation. "And never talk to my wife that way again." Quentin hesitated for a second, but then he rushed forward, his face contorted with anger, but David was faster. He grabbed Quentin's hand and, gripping his wrist tightly, literally escorted him to the door, effortlessly forcing him to leave the house. "This is your only warning," David said calmly, releasing him and taking a step back. "Stay away from Kimberly. If you ever approach her again or dare to insult her even once, you will regret it." Quentin shot him a furious look, but apparently realized that he had lost, because he just clenched his fists and, turning around, left, slamming the door loudly. A moment later, we heard the screech of tires, and his car disappeared over the horizon. David turned to me, his face softened, and there was concern in his eyes. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" I took a deep breath, feeling the tension drain from me, and wrapped my arms around his waist, snuggling into him, feeling completely safe for the first time in a long time. "I'm fine," I said softly. "I'm just glad you're home." I looked up, meeting his gaze, and a smile played on my lips. "And I'm glad you've been waiting for me after all these years." David chuckled, brushing his lips lightly against my forehead. "I've loved you since high school, Kimberly. I'd wait forever if I had to." We stood with our arms around each other, and I couldn't help but wonder at Quentin, how strangely life was turning out, how everything was going back to normal, how the past was receding, leaving room for the future. At that moment, my phone vibrated, and I took it out with a smile, looking at the screen. A message from Michael. "Mom, great news. Jessica is pregnant. You're going to be a grandmother in the next few months." I felt my heart fill with joy, and when I looked at David, I saw the same warm emotion reflected in his eyes. In the following months, life entered into a new, wonderful rhythm. Michael and his wife Jessica returned to our city, wanting to be closer to their family as they prepared for the birth of a child, and soon joined our family business, bringing fresh ideas, energy, and a new perspective to development. I was standing on the porch of a house that I had considered my prison for so long, and now it has become a place of happiness and comfort. The wind played with the yellowed leaves, the sun flooded the courtyard with soft light, and I realized that I was finally living the way I always dreamed of, without fear, without shackles, with love that warms and gives strength. I didn't just exist. I lived.